Hello, and welcome to another episode of Two Broads and Two Deep, a podcast where we talk about the Virgin new adventures starting from Timewyrm Genesis all the way through to the dying days. I'm Anthony, and as always, I'm joined by Alasdair.
Hello.
And my voice just sort of went there saying Alasdair, but good to see you. And also, we are joined by a special guest. We have Dave Kitchen from the Doctor Who show.
Hello, thanks for having me.
No worries, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. It's a pleasant Sunday evening here.
Well, thankfully, well, no, it is still raining. I thought it wasn't raining briefly there, but it is indeed still raining in Scotland as usual. So no difference here.
What a shock.
So, yeah, I guess before we kick off with our fourth episode on Timewyrm Revelation, I guess I wanted to maybe explore with you, Dave, about, how did you get into the Virgin New Adventures in the first place? Because it is quite, a niche upon niche for many fans, but, for some people it does hold quite a strong place in their heart.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Anthony. I was there at the time. I was in fandom when they were coming out, and I can actually remember being a young lad in primary school who was brought up watching Doctor Who and particularly reading the Target novels as a kid. And I can actually remember where I was when I was reading the Survival novelisation and got to the end, and there was that note from the publisher, Peter Darvill-Evans, that said, we've only got a few more books to go, and it doesn't look like they're making any more Doctor Who for a while, but we're going to be back with our own new original stories. And so I can actually remember reading that and going, oh, that's a really strange thing to do, and I wonder how that's going to go. And then I was in fandom at the time, so I was getting the local fanzine and going to the local fan club meetings, and I don't think I was getting Doctor Who magazine at that stage, but I would have been not far off. So I was going through all that sort of fan speculation of what are these books going to be like, how they're going to turn out, who's going to be writing them. And then we saw that John Peel was writing the first one, and Terence Dicks was writing the second one, and some guy called Paul Cornell that a few people had heard of, but not many had, was writing the fourth one. And then I just waited for them to arrive in the bookshops in Australia, and they came out. So the first one hit just after I turned 11, and the last one came out just as I was finishing high school. So they really did cover my teenage years, my high school years, in a really big way. So when you talk about sort of the era of the show that I really grew up with, it actually was the New Adventures. I was right in that perfect wedge for them.
It is, especially during that time, I can imagine when you have no actual Doctor Who, although I don't know if there were still those repeats potentially going on at the same time in Australia in that way, but yeah, having New Adventures in that way was, it's spots in the ground. So it's good that it was still, a seminal moment for many Doctor Who fans during the 90s in that way.
Yeah, no, it absolutely was. And there's no doubt that we sort of, thought of the lists of upcoming publications and books as being just as big as listing the titles of a new series coming out now. When the covers came out, that was kind of like getting a trailer, and it was the same level of excitement because this was new Doctor Who. And then, they were fought over just as vigorously as new episodes of Doctor Who are, except with the slight lag that everybody had to read them before we could all say whether they were brilliant or terrible.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I'm always surprised at in terms of fandom locally, and even in Australia as well, having that sense of excitement about the range in that way as well. And it was like an actual televised adventure, we're having new content coming, because even now, when we have the show on in that way, we still have book form coming out for different new adventures, and even when we have massive gaps, have been happening quite a bit for the TV show, there's not that sense of, oh well, here's a nice book adventure that the fans can go to and we all kind of rally behind when we've got massive year-long gaps or anything like that. So it's interesting that it was something that still people rallied to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, yeah, I guess on that note, one book I think many probably did rally around was this book that we're on today, which is Timewyrm Revelation. It's the fourth in the series of the whole entire new adventures, but it's indeed the fourth within the Timewyrm series and the last of that as well. Written by Paul Cornell, his very first book in general, I think, as well. And yeah, it's a book that, we'll go into a lot of detail, and I was saying before recording, I was trying to find a good way to sum up what this book was and how would we tell people about it. But I've got in front of me Bookworm, which is written by Anthony Wilson
Mm.
Robert Smith,
Very, very
about
good
the
book.
Virgin New Adventures. It's a very good tome
Oh, it's,
to help you keep you right in terms of what is happening sometimes in these
yeah,
books. And
don't leave home without
yeah,
it.
even it's got a like literally one sentence just to describe what happens in Time Worm Revelation, and it just says the Time Worm, now living as a computer virus, attacks the Doctor's mind. As a consequence, we get to psychoanalyze deeply the character that we know and love. So, hopefully that has summed up the essence of the book. But here's a wee summary of what the book is, what the story is, in Time Worm Revelation. The Doctor and Ace arrive in Cheldon Boniface and visit the local inn, the Black Swan. However, all is not as it seems as people turn to dust and Ace is chased by an astronaut. The town has actually been dreamt up on the moon as a trap by the Time Worm, using the help of Lieutenant Hemmings from Time Worm Exodus and Ace's school bully, Chad Boyle, as accomplices. Ace floats out of the fake town's atmosphere on the moon and ends up in hell, exploring its 7 circles. In the real Cheldon Boniface in 1992, perfectly mundane mass is being disturbed when the church is transported to the moon with the Reverend Trelaw and the Hutchins family, and also the church's sentient soul, Sol. The Doctor too arrives in this church on the moon, enlisting their help to save Ace, as she's not really in hell, but it's close enough. It's the Doctor's mind. As they confront those 7 circles, each curated by a Doctor, Ace faces an existential crisis of her own, facing her own fears and past through Chad and life without the Doctor. As the meetings of minds takes place in the Doctor's brain, will they destroy the Time Worm for good?
Yeah.
And that's basically the essence of Time Worm Revelation. So I'll go to maybe Alasdair first. Just overall, I know it's a massive thing to kind of delve into, but what did you feel about Time Worm Revelation?
Oh, well, first of all, it's got absolutely the right name. After the 3 books that came before it, Revelation pretty much covers what this was. This was so tonally different from what had come before. The Time Worm was so integral to the plot. We got a good idea into how the Doctor worked. We got expansion, we got consequences. It was just... It's a shame that a lot of people get stuck on the first few books of the Time Worm cycle and give up before they got to this. For my sins, I tackled the first few books a couple of times before I got to this, and I wish I'd started with this one. It's just... I love it. I just absolutely love it.
Yeah, and I guess Dave, you were saying like they were coming out in a periodic way that you were looking forward to it, and growing up, was this also one that was building up some kind of reputation when you first read it, and going to it now, does it still have that a reputation to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the third time that I've read this. I read it when it first came out, so it would have been in the Australian summer of early 1992, by the time we got copies here. And definitely there was a real sense in fandom, and particularly in the local fan circles, that this was the books arriving. The first 3, I think people had enjoyed to greater or lesser degrees, but they basically just felt like, slightly longer target novels in many ways, whereas this felt like something new and something different. And so it certainly was a big deal. I can remember as an 11-year-old, I actually didn't get a lot out of it, and probably would have ranked this third of the 4 when I was that age, because a lot of it just didn't really make a lot of sense. I didn't really appreciate the concepts. Whereas something like Genesis, look, it's got its faults, but there's a straightforward Doctor Who adventure you can follow there. Exodus, I think, is brilliant. It's still one of my top 5 new adventures. I know you guys had a few problems with it, and I get where you're coming from, but I still love it. And then when I reread Revelation when I was sort of in my mid-20s after finishing university, I thought, hey, this is amazing. I get this. This is one of the best ones out there. This is awesome. And then I read it this time, and I'm somewhere between the two. I think that it's a very good book. I think that it sets up the rest of the range really, really well. It closes down the Time Worm arc really, really well. I do think that it probably hasn't quite stood the test of time, and what was sort of big and revelationary in 1991 maybe feels a little bit dated now. And I think there are other books that did the similar thing in a better way. So I still don't think it's as good as Exodus. That's still my favorite, but I do appreciate it a lot more. And look, it's a very good book, and it's a very good read. It's a very easy read. But an interesting thing was when I read it this time, I realized how much I hadn't remembered. And I think perhaps because of the style of the book, and we can talk about this, I'm sure, it doesn't sit as a story in the memory in the way that something like a Genesis does.
It is something that's, on reflection, probably quite hard to maybe recall in such way because of how, imagery wise, it's so striking, quite elusive to kind of maybe pin down in a lot of ways. Because, like it describes, it's about talking about the psyche and exploring that. Like for myself, I actually did read this one when I was maybe like 15 or something like that. It was one of the few I had picked up, curious to know what this other side of fandom was that went before us. But this time round, now being in, well, not quite my mid-20s, late 20s now, I would humbly say, it was something I really, the visceral imagery of it is something I really enjoyed. It's in a particular, like Alasdair says, compared to some of the paint by number style we had seen things like Apocalypse, where we had more kind of generic forms and especially in the first one where it felt like a disdain of the Seventh Doctor. There's a love for having this Doctor. There's a love for having Ace as a companion and exploring their dynamics, exploring the Doctor really in a lot of different facets. And for me, the way it's written as well, it's quite striking visuals. It is something that is quite a revelation of tone, and it's maybe one that actually does live up to the too broad and too deep idea, because I could not imagine it on TV at all. But I really love and can still see it in the mind in terms of how the visions are within it.
It certainly feels like a book that for the first time is written by someone who was the right age to really love the McCoy era and really love the McCoy Doctor. I think that Dix writes the McCoy Doctor reasonably well. I think Peel clearly doesn't like him. I think Robinson just doesn't understand him. But Paul Cornell doesn't just write for him well, he actually gets him. And you can see in this book threads that were coming out of the McCoy era that others just hadn't quite picked on yet or picked up yet, and that's really really evident. It's the first one sort of clearly written by a proper McCoy fan.
Yeah.
For me, the comparison with Apocalypse is very, very relevant. Apocalypse feels like a classic Who adventure, like one from Doctors 1 through to 7. Revelation feels more like New Who. It's bigger, it's broader, it's more ambitious, it just feels like a whole paradigm shift between classic to new.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's a really, really good strength if you're setting up the range. The weakness, of course, is that if you are 11 and you're somebody who was watching it as a kid, you're just going, sorry, what? So it's a really important tonal shift that I think we look at now and go, this is fantastic, because we were all growing up. But it was also a problem in getting younger fans into the range, I think.
But you could argue they weren't looking for younger fans at this point. They were looking for the fans that had grown up with the series and were looking to continue it down darker. They had a freedom that they just didn't get when the television series was on the air. But the problem is, I was quite young as well when these came out, and I just wouldn't have got them at all. So your point's valid. Yeah, we lost all of the audience.
Yeah. I'm in that sort of unfortunate position that I was like right at the tail end of that group of fandom. So a lot of the people that I was in fandom with were all at university or early 20s, and so they're going, "This is fantastic," and I'm just at that tail. And it probably took 2 or 3 years where I could really appreciate the books properly. Yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the key, ideas of kind of what I was saying about, going into New Who in a lot of ways was the characterization. Like, we didn't. There were some moments in this, and in particular with Doctor and Ace, where it was so raw in terms of their emotion, in terms of the dynamics with characters, that it was something we would never see explored within the classic series. And to that side, it felt fresh, and is something you could see replicated in New Who. Like, I think Russell T Davies quoted once about it, saying how visceral characters and how grounded characters can get in Doctor Who, and quoted Time on Revelation as an example of where this started, and it's an interesting place for that to maybe be the genesis, as it were, ironically, of this. But you can see some of those ideas even still within like the new series itself, like in terms of
Oh, aye.
the idea of exploring the mind and being stuck within a sort of mind sphere and things like Silence in the Library.
Yeah.
And
Oh, Mr. Clever and Nightmare in Silver.
yeah, like there's influences that you can see perhaps towards other writers about thinking of Doctor Who in a different way that perhaps don't go as far in the, not, I don't say fanfic way, but steeped in the lore sort of way that Time One Revelation can go into, and that could be exclusionary.
Yeah, absolutely. And stuff like
Hmm.
the past incarnations in the Mindscape is straight. There's a straight lift from that in Power of the Doctor.
Yeah, in fact, to the point that I think the
Yep.
first Doctor is in the library in a red robe, and when at some point in
Yes.
between universes at the edge, and it's very much like, did Chibnall just have a wee read of this before trying to think of something up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, even the ideas about to an extent, the idea of the church, and I was gonna say church on Ruby Road. I'm too used to saying that recently. The church from in Father's Day, having a story set stuck in a church. It's not Reavers outside kind of battering at the doors. It's the vacuum of space, but there's ideas that have the cons of something that then get explored further, perhaps, to be painted on in the actual series as well, which I did find quite enjoyable.
because Cornell himself's quite a deeply religious man, and he's never made a secret of it. But I think he's done quite well in bringing the church setting into it, and giving it a reverence, but never hitting anyone over the head with, "This is really important. You need to find this important." He sets the tone quite nicely, I felt.
Yeah, and he takes that Doctor Who, and indeed it broader UK television trope of the sleepy English village, and condenses that and distills that down to the church, the vicar, the families, and really just sort of gives you that essence of it, and then puts it on the moon so you're completely disorientated. But yeah, it's a real distillation of that sort of stuff that you see the Church of England church really sort of representing.
Yeah, and even in terms of that quintessential English way that Doctor Who can sometimes verge quite strongly into and lean quite strongly onto, I think there's something within Paul Cornell's writing as well that brings it out in how characters like the Doctor can operate in a way, like, ironically for a Scottish Doctor, but in terms of how at one point Saul, which is for the audience, the disembodied soul of a church building, who just can talk to the local vicar here and there. He talks about how the Doctor talks about intelligence coming from anything and evolving from anything, and he once remembered how he had a nice chat with a sentient pot of jam. And it's small moments like this that it feels quite quintessential in perhaps the Englishness of it, but it's quite a lovely aspect that folk perhaps remember from the show, not from perhaps the eras, the latest era at that time with McCoy, but from not just maybe Pertwee, but even Peter Davison, which I think was before McCoy came along, Paul Cornell's favourite Doctor. And so there's the quintessential Englishness of Peter Davison's Doctor, and that side of it that maybe shines through quite sometimes in Paul Cornell's writing.
Yeah, I mean, Paul Cornell was certainly famous for loathing the third Doctor, but yes, I think he was quite fond of the fifth. And just the other thing with the example you mentioned about the pot of jam and everything, it's very obvious as well. I think Cornell's the first writer who grew up having read Douglas Adams as a young man, and I think that you get a real sort of not the humour, because people who usually try to rip off Douglas Adams do very very badly, but a certain amount of that sort of English bonkersness of Adams' work definitely comes through. You can feel as though he grew up, as we probably all did, reading that as a teenager.
Yeah, because the whole idea of a sentient church, they don't go into any great depth as to why Saul's alive and talking to everyone. It's just, he's a church, he's alive, let's move on. And it's just so absurd that you take it at face value and run with it. And he ends up being a bit of a favourite of mine, to be perfectly honest. It's...
Yeah. I think, and everyone does as well, whenever there's a bizarre situation near the beginning as well in the tavern, when all the sort of vagabonds within the inn are just blindly following orders, and the doctor questions like, well, why are you chasing me? Like, what is your point here? And they go, that's a good point. I don't know why I'm chasing you. And it's just not quite farcical, but very matter of factly, like, yeah, this is a bizarre situation, but it's what we're doing. This is what we're in. It's lovely. It's lovely moments like that. Now we had character wise. We mentioned Saul as the sentient church. Now within the church there were the Hutchings, Emily and Peter, and the Reverend Trelaw as well. How did you find perhaps having that sort of base of characters as well throughout the book?
I just thought they were a really nice combination. You had the old English vicar, man of faith. They can never think of like, oh, I don't know if it should be going like that. You've got the blatant mathematician stroke scientist with Peter, and then by the way, she's psychic. It was like three very basic tropes, and they should have been quite jarring and not worked, but they formed quite a nice wee family unit, and you found yourself rooting for them. They felt like a real, maybe not so much the Reverend Trelaw, but Peter and Emily felt like a real couple from the second they appeared on the page. They were almost fully formed right from the get-go. And yeah, loved them.
Yeah, what I found really interesting about them was that even within the dynamic that you spoke about there, Alasdair, where you've got sort of the Reverend and the scientist and the psychic lady, they all sort of blurred a little bit as well. So there was never sort of one, well, this person will always have this view and this person will always have that view. They were actually human beings who occasionally had a bit of doubt or a bit of difference, and the Reverend would sometimes be the more enthusiastic rather than the more cautious, and the mathematician would sometimes be driven less by the maths, but more by the fact that he's worried about his wife. So they actually did feel like just really lovely people. And it's important because although this is a big book in terms of the concepts, it's an incredibly small book in terms of the story and the characters. I mean, we have a couple of extra baddies and basically 3 extra goodies, and that's it for the whole book. And really only one plot. There's no real sort of A plot, B plot, C plot. There's just one long plot with sort of different aspects. And it's only because these people feel like such real characters that they are able to sustain a whole book.
Yeah, and even in terms of, like you say, in terms of the villains themselves, the personification of them through, Chad Boyle or Hemmings, were good different personifications to take on, but it did make me realise again that the Timewyrm isn't really a character. It's basically, the Timewyrm is what hinges a lot of the exploration of the Doctor's mind on. It's not really the driving force. It's the Timewyrm decides to drive that through the personification of the bully, of the Nazi. It's not quite all the time, here's that slithering Timewyrm from Genesis as much. And I don't know if, in terms of the Timewyrm in this, I guess, because it is the last story with that Timewyrm, how did you find how it, operated in this way? Because it's quite a different, way, and in terms of how it's written, in terms of how it acts as well, in terms of being more computerized in its sort of functions.
Yeah, I think that the book makes a difficult but correct choice, and the 4 books together, I think, make the right choice. I know you guys have discussed this both when you talk about Exodus and Apocalypse, but I've always sort of thought that if the Timewyrm was in those 2 books more, and it was 4 continuing confrontations between the Doctor and the Timewyrm, which ended with the Timewyrm going, "Oh, curses, you've got me this time, Doctor, but I'll be back next book," that would have just completely undermined the character's credibility. So sidelining her for book 2 and 3, just having her influence rather than confront, I think was the right decision. And that allows for the confrontation and revelation. The downside of that, and I think it's a necessary downside of that, is that perhaps we haven't quite got to know the Timewyrm as much as we should have, particularly as Ishtar isn't the time worm in most of Genesis. She only becomes it in the last couple of chapters. So we actually don't get to see much of the time worm doing time wormy things outside of a few chapters in Exodus and what a couple of lines in Apocalypse. So this all feels very new. It works, but it doesn't quite feel like it's built up over 4 books. But again, I think that if they had tried to do that, we'll be sitting here going, well, how pathetic's the time when she loses 3 out of 4, or 4 out of 4 in the end.
Yeah, for me, this was the most we'd seen the Time Worm. Like you're saying, David, full stop. We hadn't really seen the Time Worm in the first one. It was her Genesis, damn you, John Peel. Sidelined in Apocalypse and Exodus, like you said, but we got a real feel for her this time round, and she felt more immediate, she felt more threatening. The fact that she was lodged deep in the Doctor's psyche made her very urgent, very almost intimate as a threat. It was... And this could be controversial. I think, as far as the Time Worm goes, we could have had just this book and missed the first 3, but not missed overly much. She felt a lot more threatening this time. And transplanted her into a baby at the end and still saying that she'll remain this grand concept, but also this teeny tiny baby, was probably about the only way you could really deal with such a large concept. It was... You know, now I'm thinking about this, Paul Cornell wrote an awful lot about this, and I don't really know how much he dealt with the actual concept. That's clever in itself.
Yeah, I think that's all very, very fair. And I think you're right that they did make the threat very, very intimate. And that works in some ways as a book, but also, if you ask me the question, what would have happened had the Doctor not succeeded in this book, and what threat did the Time Worm pose to anything else, I don't know I could really articulate that. So that's probably, again, looking at it very, very, in a way that it wasn't intended to be looked at. But I do think that it works for this book, but it maybe doesn't quite work as a bigger concept.
Yeah, like basically in this book, in terms of how it's resolved, I didn't actually think of it in that way of, especially at the end being turned into baby. I was like, well, again, influences into the new series, things like Boomtown and how Margaret Blaine gets turned into an egg for like a rebirth of life at that point. But it was building up such a concept, and it's more so in terms of editorial reasons of Peter W. Evans wanting to have such a ultimate threat to start off in a bang, that you can never quite live up to that. I guess you can never quite live up to this idea of having this ultimate creature with immortality potentially. It's very hard to have that, especially to kick off a series with folk who are used to, developing target novelizations of quite traditional Doctor Who stories that aren't of that ilk, and it shows that the only person who could try to reach for the stars in that way was someone who was just completely new and wanted to see what they could get away with, as it were, in the book form with Paul Cornell. And he did try something very, very different, very intimate by going exploring the threat that the Time Worm could be into the Doctor's mind as well.
And it's, while you're mentioning that, it's also worth noting that he indulged in what I've referred to before as fan wank, and I think under another author it could have come over as self-indulgent, nerdy, not very well, but he's actually introduced all these elements and made it sing. I think it was a different style of writing than what we were used to, and I think Peter Darvill Evans took a huge chance in Cornell, and it has paid off in spades. I mean, if the rest of the series had been like Exodus, it wouldn't have been terrible. As David said, it's a great book, it's a cracking book, it's in his top selection for a reason, but it's very much a continuation of what came before. This changed the goalposts.
Yeah, no, it absolutely did. And it's interesting because I remember the fan wank stuff you talked about being debated in fandom at the time. And one of the things that people did comment on was okay, Cornell's brought back multiple iterations of the Doctor to be in this book. And if this had just been the only time they'd done it in 4 books, that would be fine. But you get the third and the fourth Doctor turn up in Genesis. You get another one turn up in Apocalypse. And then so like 3 out of 4 books, you've got previous incarnations coming back. Because obviously you don't have to pay actors and you don't have to do a big celebration. But it did give a bit of a feel that maybe this range was going to look a bit further backwards than it maybe should.
Yes.
And that was a bit debated at the time. Now we know what came afterwards. It actually just wasn't a big deal, and they kind of got that out of their system. But it was a point of concern at the time, yeah.
Yeah. It was not just past Doctors. He made the leader from Inferno a possible alternative Doctor, and that was
Yes.
a couple of lines, but wow, the implications from that are. But this is what Cornell does. He introduces ideas retrospectively and makes you think they were there all the time. Because that idea about the leader being the Doctor changes everything about Inferno. But it's still rollicking good fun. It's...
Yeah, he introduces quite a few, well, some very briefly mentioned ideas. Like, I think this is the first book we have the mention of the other. Because it's when Emily's going through the time vortex and she's seeing the exploration of the Doctor's life, and it's just her and the other, and it's just not mentioned again. It's just there, and equally, you know, for like Ace down the line, like her potential futures of I could, you know, saunter around Berlin in the 1930s or Paris in 1880s, and so there's future references there too.
Because the other had cropped up before in Remembrance of the Dalek, which once it straddles the lines between a new adventure and a target book as well. But this is the first mention of the other proper within the new adventures. And if you missed the capitalisation of the other, you lost nothing. It was so very, very clever. He left it there in plain sight for us to catch in the rereads. And yeah, it's clever. What can I say?
Yeah, and I think when we talk about Paul Cornell's writing as well in particular, in previous episodes we've talked about some of the immaturity on the idea of being mature that the series wants to explore on ideas that are too broad and too deep. And we do get, you know, quite a lot of violence and quite a but it's more so about some of the mature ideas that are explored. And I find quite an interesting quote from Paul Cornell from Doctor Who magazine 178 when he's been interviewed about, you know, this series and why people are wanting it to be more adult, like we saw unfortunately in Genesis and things like that. And he said it depends how it's done. I consider adult to mean mature, talking to adults, not adolescent readers who want sex and violence and believe that's what being adult is, but actually what being adult is about. Society, attitudes, and getting on with people. And so it's that essence that I think that comes through in the book really strongly compared to, you know, Ace, you know, getting dressed for 3 pages in Genesis.
Yes.
Yeah, it's definitely a theme across the new adventures that it's very clear most of the authors are in their 20s and have a thing for either Ace and or Sophie Aldred. And that definitely is comes through in their work. Not always in a creepy way, but sometimes in a creepy way. But it's definitely a big influence on the new adventures, just that all these people just have a crush on Sophie Aldred, who, look, she's a beautiful woman, probably. But Cornell does seem to resist that here, yes.
Yeah, to maybe to an extent, because he actually goes maybe in the opposite direction, where there's quite a few references to Ace saying, oh, she needs to get some exercise, so she needs to lose a few pounds, and it's a bit odd how that comes up.
Yeah, her flabby thighs come up at one point, I think.
Yeah. it's a bit bizarre. You know, especially how used to, you know, the John Peel style writing of it was that we had recently. But yeah, it's still odd that even there's still some form of objectification towards her, even in this, regardless of his ideas of maturity.
But even that, I feel that was him trying to prove to us that that wasn't quite our race. That she'd got to be a bit girly, she was into boys, she was all things that we knew our race not to be. There was a wee hint that things weren't as they should be for her.
Yeah, but Well, that was within when she was the Dorothy character, but
Aye,
where
Dory.
there was quite a few throughout the book, where she was having it as well,
Okay, fair enough.
where there was kind of some references to it, and yeah, it was bizarre. But I guess talking of that, we best maybe talk about some of the exploration of the Doctor and Ace in this as well, because as much as we are in the Doctor's psyche, there's so much exploration of Ace and her
Mm.
psyche and the different stages of her life and what could be of her life if she didn't, you know, be as rebellious. And yeah, I don't know where to even maybe start with this. Maybe with the start of the splintering in this book. It's mentioned in the back of the book how Ace dies by getting her head caved in by Chad, her bully, in school. So yeah, how did you find the different stages of Ace in this book?
I found some better than others. I think I did struggle a bit with some of the Dory stuff. Not initially, but I did sort of feel that by the third or fourth iteration of her story, I was like, okay, I get it. Can we sort of move on a bit from here? Because it is very hard to sort of characterize somebody of that nature. It was interesting to sort of get this real sense of the childhood of Ace and sort of just really understand that she wasn't always this confident person, and maybe she sort of is troped a bit as a bit of a Doctor Who fan, slightly weirder, slightly more or less popular than other kids were, and you sort of get all that to come through. But it does all hinge on her relationship with the Doctor, and this to me feels like somebody who watched The Curse of Fenric and said, I want to do a lot more of that. And I'm not sure that it comes out naturally at this point. I think that again, when we look at Ace and where she would go in the range, it seems a very natural and logical progression. But at the time, it did seem almost not jarring. That's too strong a word, but a little bit disconnected from where we'd been. Even though we had seen that sort of stuff in Curse of Fenric. But my final sort of thought on this is the only real struggle that I think that we had, because Cornell does it very well, is at the end of it, I couldn't quite believe that Ace would get back in the TARDIS and go off with this guy. That was the hardest part. Now give it 5 books, and maybe that's going to change. Spoilers, but spoilers for something 30 years ago. But it was hard at the end of this to go. Why did she get in the TARDIS with the Doctor at the end of this? So, there wasn't quite that scene at the end of Fenric, where Ace jumps off the cliffs and she has the swim, and then they have the Scooby Doo moment. It lacked that, and that's very hard to do in a book. And I think that was the one flaw in what he did.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. It did seem, I'm mad. Okay, are we going now? It's like, where did that anger go? That wasn't really resolved. It was. But apart from that, I have to say, I thought Cornell did a good job of telling us who Ace was by showing us who Ace wasn't. And the fact that we're all sitting there going, that's not Ace, that wasn't Ace, that wasn't Ace, shows that we had a good idea of who Ace was. And it was almost like painting him in abstract, not abstracted negative. By showing the things she wasn't, we get a better idea of who she was. And what occurred to me reading it, there's one point where I think it's a Timewyrm refers to her as either Dory or Dorothy, and the Doctor growls, her name is Ace,
Yeah,
which reads a lot better now than it did back then. It says the chosen name, who she's chosen to be, matters. This is important. She was born Dorothy, she grew up Dory, she's chosen to be Ace. And that, I have to say, that spoke to me quite a bit. I really, really liked that.
yeah, good point.
Yeah, and I guess also with the other side of the exploration of who each character is, the Doctor in this, in terms of exploring his psyche and exploring what he has as guilt and trying to explore his feelings. It's something that it didn't feel as clear cut in terms of here's what he isn't. In a lot of ways it was more so about his guilt, about his subconscious and the side that he doesn't act upon. And there's a reference in terms of the woman's side of him, which is made up of the three witches being maiden, mother, and crone, and it's interesting reading that now, saying that, oh yeah, the Doctor doesn't have a woman's side that complements his psyche. But I don't know how you found his exploration of the Doctor's psyche and his feelings in this as well.
Yeah, I have to agree. The Doctor ignoring his feminine side doesn't feel right now. It possibly fitted quite well at the time, and one of the I was reading in Bookworm, they were suggesting that someone was suggesting that this is why the Doctor hung about with young women. He was using them to represent his feminine side, and that felt a bit like armchair psychology to me and didn't really work. But in terms of Doctor's psyche, it was really nice to see him picking and choosing what parts of himself he was expressing and actively repressing the parts of himself that he didn't want to be on show. And I feel like he maybe done a bit more with that. Like burying his conscience, basically crucifying his conscience up in the tree. Cornell wasn't even subtle about that. The wounds in the hands and the side, it was like, yeah, that they've crucified the Fifth Doctor. He has chosen to repress whole parts of himself. I felt they could have done something more with that, but I like the idea of picking and choosing what parts of his personality he was expressing, and that who he was a very deliberate choice.
Yes, and how his previous incarnations deal with that as well, I think was interesting, and perhaps a bit of a mirror of the way that the McCoy Doctor was debated in fandom, certainly at the time and probably still now. This sort of idea that some of his incarnations would go, I don't recognise the way you handle this, and others are sort of like, yep, that's perfectly fine. This is just a natural extension of what we do. And then at the same time, bringing back that guilt over his failures, having Katerina and Sarah and Adric come back in the form of guilt was really, really effective, because it was setting up the Doctor in a way that we just hadn't had before. It really was taking that McCoy era, and not even the whole McCoy era, that's sort of the last half of the McCoy era, and really sort of expanding it. And one thing that I found really interesting was the overt way that the Doctor does all his setting up after the book, which, if you look at the sort of the evolution of that, Remembrance and Silver Nemesis both have the Doctor in the past doing stuff to set up what the McCoy Doctor would do. Battlefield's, I think, the one first time where he sends the letter in the future to let him know what to do in the present. And again, you can feel Cornell watching that and going, I want to do more of that. And this is now the first time, though, that we actually see the Doctor finish an adventure, and then the epilogue go, right, well, I need to go here and make sure they meet. I need to go here and rescue a baby to drop it off here, because I'm going to do that halfway. And that again, is just taking this idea and taking it to a whole nother level.
And it's hard to imagine Moffat doing the Pandora Opens without this book, because that felt very, very Moffat-y at points. Kind of crisscrossing his own time stream, which I love, by the way. I'm not having a dig.
Yeah, and we know that Moffat was hanging around the tavern with these guys at the time, so yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and yeah, like I do think, yeah, how this Doctor is in comparison to, we do get hints of influence within some of our Timewyrm books, but having this one being fully that style of Doctor is something is quite fresh to have, and especially with that relation with Ace. I know it's probably the strongest it's been in terms of his manipulation of her, but there are moments where he is genuine. He's not always consistently cold to her. He still has remorse at points to her, saying, I'm wanting to do as much as I can, but I don't want the Timewyrm to know. And he does sometimes have the frankness to her that she wants and respects, because it then helps us to feel worse when he betrays her again, as it were, because he is trying his best, but she feels consistently let down despite that. So it is helpful that he's not just this cold, calculating Doctor with no remorse for his companion in any way. Having that balance and at least, self-reflection is something that's quite helpful in this Doctor too.
Yeah, and there is a coldness and a callousness there that at the time was definitely a struggle for me. And even now I read it and sort of go, only the McCoy Doctor could get away with this, and I'm not even sure that he does at times.
It's a fair point. I also quite liked Cornell managed to deepen their relationship by throwing in the lines that in between adventures they used to sit down with cups of cocoa and just talk about things. And it was like retroactively making the relationship more personable, more intimate, more involved. And once again, that's a couple of lines, but it changed how we looked at the past adventures. And yeah, I was a lot more invested in Ace and the Doctor after reading this book than I was before it. He did good work with them, I felt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that exploration of their relationship is something Paul Cornell, from his love of this duo, is something that he wants to explore whenever he can. Like, I think his first, because he wrote some of the ideas that he had for Time and Revelation in a fanzine in Queenbat quite a few years before, when it was the Fifth Doctor era. But he did, I think it was Doctor Who magazine, where he did Teenage Kicks, which is a short story where it explores Ace's, again, kind of confronting her fears in that way. So it's a side that I think he really wanted to probably bring, and it's not a surprise that he brought it to his first novel within the series.
And that's the thing, there is a feeling that this is a new writer throwing every idea he's ever had at the wall and hoping some of it sticks. And he had a very high hit rate with what he threw to the wall and what stuck. And a lot of writers would have done this and it would have come off as fanficky and awful, but the man can write, and it shows that he can write. And then, thank God he was writing.
Yeah, I mean, he was 25, I think, when he wrote this. When I was looking there, so he was just bursting full of energy in a way that, later in that interview I mentioned, he talks about how some of the best writers that he knows, probably from the tavern, are fans, are ones who are just bursting with new ideas about what to say, what to do, and what to explore.
I was reading a wee bit there on the Who Adventures by David Howe about this was his first proper real bit of professional work. He'd done a wee bit in DWM, like you said. He'd done Queen Bat, and shortly after this he got a play put on and some work shown in the BBC. But this was the what kicked it off for him. This is the first thing that made him feel like a writer, and yeah, this is not a bad way to start your writing career.
No, not
It's
at all.
a very good way to start your writing career.
No, it's absolutely not. And credit to Peter Darvill Evans for commissioning him, because obviously the first three authors, Peel, Dixon, and Robinson, were very, very safe picks. They were well-known, established names that any Doctor Who fan who was active at the time and would have been considering buying these books would go, I know those guys can write. I've got their books. I know they know the show. And safe is good to start you and just, reassure everyone. But then for the fourth book and the big finale of their four-part arc, to go with a 25-year-old newbie, that took a lot of confidence. And I think it's reflective of the attitude that Darvill Evans and Virgin had. Where I mean, they had a proper open submission policy for these books. And that was rare then. It's unheard of now.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it allowed them to take chances that they just couldn't have taken if the series was still on the air. You'd had to have... I mean, even now, I think the maturity level of the Doctor Who books we're getting now is pretty decent. It's good storytelling, but they have to have all the toys back at the same place at the end as they are at the start. There is no proper development there, curtailed by the series. Whereas the new adventures, all bets were off. And this is the first time that really, really showed. And yeah, I think had the show kept going, Darvill Evans could not have taken the chances that he took. And I mean, going with Exodus and Apocalypse, it wouldn't have been a terrible set of books. It would have been a very different set of books. It would have been a nice wee continuation of the Target range. And that would have been fine. But taking the chance changed everything.
Yeah, as is the case for most eras of the show on television. The ones that take chances, generally the ones that are remembered.
Yeah, and there's a reason we're not still watching it in black and white with a CGI William Hartnell. The show has to change. We have to move forward, and Who's always been very good at changing to reflect what's going on round about it. It's part of why we're still watching it over 60 years after it started. It can adapt, and the New Adventures were the 90s adaptation.
Yes, and they feel incredibly 90s. And occasionally when people have pointed that out to me, I say, well, Go and watch the Seward era and tell me that doesn't feel incredibly 80s, etc., etc. You know, and even the Eccleston era, you watch it now and you go, you know, anybody who didn't know when that was made could look at that and go, that was made about 2005 because it just has all those stamps on it. That's just Doctor Who.
Yeah, and if you same as you, if you watch any BBC dramas from the 60s, you can see your unearthly child's DNA in there. It's
Yeah.
the show's always reflective of when it's made, and that's no bad thing.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, and indeed, actually, I think this is the first novel where we are fully like in the 90s actually as well. You know, we are getting a pocket quite literally of the 90s on the moon, in the most you know Doctor Who way of having that pocket of the 90s. So yeah, I do think the exploration of the decade is hopefully now reflective in the style that we saw kind of going forward. So I guess yeah, maybe overall I just get some maybe kind of final thoughts on perhaps Timewyrm Revelation as it's in its own standing, but also maybe over the whole range of the Timewyrm story. So Dave, I don't know if you want to kick off.
This is obviously a really, really well written book. It's a really interesting book. If you're asking me to say, you know, is it my personal favourite? Is it in my top 10? The answer is no. There are other books out there that I think are personally better or that I enjoy more or that I've picked up more. But it's certainly, you know, up in the top 20 or so. But if you ask me to make a list of books that are most important to the range and most important to continuing the series over the course of the 1990s, this is absolutely in the top 5. It's a pivotal book that sets the range up. It's a pivotal book that sets the tone for what would eventually become the new series. And it's a really good adventure with a stunningly good cover.
Whereas for me, that this one is quite easily in my top 5 for the new adventures. It's
Great.
and that's just me. That's personal preference. There's no right or wrong answer to this one. And
Yeah.
it possibly even occupies the top spot, but mostly because we can't have Cold Fusion in there because it's technically speaking a missing adventure. It's no, I just really enjoyed it. It was a handbrake turn from what had gone before in the Timewyrm series, and I was glad of it. I think if it had 3 books previous that had been the same as it, we wouldn't have felt the impact quite as much. I think it came at exactly the right point at the right time, and this is about my 3rd time rereading it, and I had as much of a blast this time as I did the first few times. And
Yeah.
yeah, big fan.
Can I ask, Alistair, do you think had it opened with a book of this style rather than doing the Safer 3, it would have worked? Or did it need that Safe 3 to get everyone in and then go, right, now you're in, let's go?
That's a really good question. I think it. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, I'd have said you should have started with this and just this. But I think having reread it again, it needs the context of the 3 books, and it works better for being in a complete tonal shift. You need to see the sand shifting, and that's what happens. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Yeah. So for myself, it's compared to when we did maybe 15 years ago, it is something that is completely different now in my mind. It's something that's imagery is so visceral in terms of the exploration of the psyche, exploration of characters in a way that we haven't had in this series of books so far. It is something more akin to the new series, and that's something that I really love about this. I would say as well, yeah, if we started with a book like this, it would be. I can imagine. I mean, we were getting the headlines anyway from what was it, the Sun saying Doctor Blue, when it was talking about Ace getting changed in Genesis. I have no idea what captions we would be having for news stories if this was the first book where we're decapitating Nazis on the moon, and yeah, it would be such a bizarre place to start with. I think for some, so I think having some buffer, perhaps not, to be honest, all 3, because there's kind of coasting along. Then we get to Exodus, and there's something good there. Then we're coasting along again, and then we're suddenly in this realm of a new era that it probably needed to ramp up better. So having maybe something like a Apocalypse or Genesis style story, and then Exodus, and then this, so that we're ramping up where we're going rather than kind of more bumpy flight of a rocket to the moon that we had for this. But I really enjoyed reading this one. I really enjoyed the exploration of the Doctor's and Ace relationship in particular, and the fan wink actually was there for a reason. So that's always a positive to have. Now, we had some comments written in from some folk, so I'm just going to give a wee shout out to some folk who wrote in. So we had Oscar Groucho on Twitter, at Oscar Grouchos, who said it was an explosion of the character that resembles tent poles of the format to examine quiet character study. Some of the most startling iconography of the range, reaching forward to the modern show, such as like the astronaut and Power. PC Molden, the disparate Paul Cornell. I was wondering what the PC was. I was thinking it was a Timewyrm for a second. PC Molden, the disparate books into a unified whole, essential. And yeah, I think, like we said, it's quite an essential book to understand what this range is going forward.
Absolutely.
We had some from Facebook as well. We had Simon Belcher saying it was an absolutely enjoyable read from beginning to end. Jeremy Gunter saying it's an amazing book. Modern Doctor Who has mined every idea, syllable and comma out of this story. Which, yeah, we can certainly see some aspects come through.
Yeah, agreed.
And Ross Moore says, the first book in the range to really live up to being too broad and too deep for the small screen. Genesis may have been the first, but this really was the beginning. So, yeah, I think everyone feels that this has a seminal place, regardless of the feelings of the story and exploration itself. It is a seminal piece, perhaps.
Absolutely.
For everyone. So, thanks again for joining us. Thank you, Dave, for joining us. I don't know if you want to give a wee plug for your own show and how things are going on the Doctor Who show for yourselves.
Oh, look, that's very kind of you. Yes, thank you for having me along. I'll turn up anywhere and talk about the Virgin books. But yes, if you want to check us out on the Doctor Who show, just look for us on all the various different social medias and podcatchers and the like. We do a monthly episode on a variety of topics. We do hot takes on the new episodes. We do our list makers and just whatever else comes into our mind. So yeah, please, you're very welcome to have a look. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks again, Dave, for joining us, and thanks, Alasdair, as always.
Yeah. Pleasure.
And we'll see you all in our next episode, which is on Cat's Credo, Timed Crucible by Mark Platt. See you then.
Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Two Broad and Two Deep. You can get in touch with us via email at twobroad2deeppod@gmail.com. That's with the words TOO. You can then also get in touch with us on social media, such as Twitter and Instagram, which is at 2broad2deeppod, and that's with the number 2. We also have a Facebook page, Doctor Who 2 Broad and 2 Deep, and that's the word again, TOO. Hope to hear from you soon.